With me today is Samantha de Bendern and Mathieu Boulegue. Did I say that right? No. So. You'll have to excuse me, Mathieu.
Not bad.
And our topic today, which is going to be basically the main focus of our Q&A, is obviously the current Ukrainian operation in Russia in the region of Kursk. We are going to be discussing here and presenting questions to our two experts, asking them specific questions about the potential implications, about how this situation might develop, about the potential situation implication in terms of how this might impact the strategy of the two countries, and so on. I'll present those questions to them. If you too have questions that you wish to present to our speakers, please use the chat function. Write it down. Just a short reminder, questions are short and with a question mark at the end. It's important, but I always find it to be necessary to remind everybody about that. So, first question, Samantha, is to you. Mathieu, Samantha, no need to put your microphone on mute. You can be completely on loud one. So, Samantha, the first question to you is quite, I would say, direct in terms of what is or what are the objectives the Ukrainians are trying to achieve with this operation in the Kursk region?
Well, I mean, that is the question that everyone has, and I'm not even sure the Ukrainians themselves are completely sure about these objectives. And I think that the first thing that I really want to say is the success of the operation has probably been a big surprise to the Ukrainians. The question of how it was organized is one of the ones that it comes at foremost. It seems from discussions I've had with people on the ground in Sumy right now that the operation was organized by a mix of drone surveillance over a period of time and commando incursions that the Ukrainians are good at doing under cover of night and to try and understand where the weak points are. So the initial aim was probably to show that we can go in. Russian border is not very well guarded. The aims, I think, have changed as the operation has progressed and as the success has grown. Now, what could Ukraine be looking to achieve here? So one thing, of course, would be to improve a potential position for negotiations. Zelensky has been saying for a while now that maybe negotiations could happen. There's probably going to be another peace conference before the end of this year, at which Russian representatives could potentially be invited. So is this a good thing or a bad thing? Is this a signal that Ukraine is prepared to negotiate something, or is it a signal that Ukraine is saying, we're not negotiating 1 inch of territory, because if we let go of territory, we're going to make life difficult for you for the foreseeable future? And that is one aim. Another potential aim, which has certainly been a success, is to show Russian weakness in terms of how badly its borders are guarded, and Russian weakness in terms of the chaos within the military. Now, I want to remind people that the Russian military has gone through some pretty turbulent times recently. Since April, 17 high-level military officers, from generals to lieutenant colonels, have either been fired, resigned, or become suddenly sick and died. And a lot of other people have been falling out of windows, people who have been involved in corruption investigations or corruption suspicion related to military procurement. So there's a lot of febrility, and of course the defense minister himself has been moved aside, and I'd be happy to go into more details during the questions if you want for this. So showing up Russia's weakness to Russia itself, to Russians, showing Russia's weakness to the world. First of all, showing Russia's weakness to the Western partners who've been saying to Ukraine, oh, you can't possibly strike into Russian territory because the Russian response will be devastating. And showing Russia's weakness to other neighbors of Russia. China will be looking at what is happening in a very, very interested way, because Russia's strength is that it is so big. Russia's weakness is that it is so big. And how is it able to guard its borders? And so by exposing Russia's weakness, Ukraine is also sowing chaos within the Russian government. And you just have to see Putin's expression when he's talking about what's happening and how the conflicts between the FSB, which is the security services, which are supposed to be in charge of the border, and the military is now becoming more obvious to everybody. And another issue could be create a buffer zone to protect Ukraine from this region of Russia, from where a lot of the strikes are happening. This is also a way to draw Russian troops from areas of the front where Ukraine is suffering to defend the zone that Ukraine has now invaded. And some of the more cynical people would also say it's also detracting the world's attention from the fact that Ukraine is having a very difficult time now in keeping up, in defending two key areas in Chasiv Yar and Konstantinivka. So, I've not given you an answer to what these aims are. I've given you some suppositions because nobody really knows what these aims are. John Kirby said on Friday, we are trying to understand from our Ukrainian partners what the strategy is here. So if he doesn't know, I don't know either. I'm just coming up with some hypotheses.
Thank you, Samantha. I want to redirect the question to Mathieu. There are two sides, so to speak, to this. One is that says the objective is more tactical, relief from another front, make sure that the movements that the Russians are basically are dedicating resources and are basically moving troops from the Ukrainian Eastern Front to protect their own territory, and by that giving relief to Ukrainian troops. Another is a strategic one, which is Ukraine will try to withhold the territory for future potential negotiations and so on. But also maybe there are others. Same question that I directed to Samantha, I'm direct to you if you can add something about that. What do you think are the Ukrainian objectives when it comes to this offensive?
I mean, I think the grand strategy remains, right? It's to free Ukraine of Russian troops and go back to the established borders prior to 2014. The grand strategy hasn't changed. In terms of the military objectives, I fully agree with what Samantha said. There is a lot of operational security and secrecy that is still achieved, which in a way is a good excuse to say we don't know exactly what's going on because there is still operational security at the tactical operational level. And considering where we are, 2.5 years into a war that is slowly grinding to a halt in terms of big and large advances, reaching operational surprise and taking the initiative and surprising Russia itself is an objective. It has become, in a way, an end in and on itself, beyond the symbolic of the operation, the sort of huge morale boost and PR stunt that Ukraine has achieved. I mean, I will also remember the symbols behind it. The Battle of Kursk, 81 years ago. The Kursk submarine disaster, 24 years ago. It really is sending this sort of shock and awe message that no one is safe in Russia, that the war is not under control. And this very simple question, how can Russia conquer Ukraine if it cannot even defend its own borders? So that, that is in itself, I think, not the end game, but a pathway to an end game yet to be determined in terms of the actual objective. I think we will discover more as we go in terms of the real end game. We can speculate on, is it gas infrastructure in Suja to sort of own some of the logistics here? Is it the Kursk nuclear power plant in Kurchatov, which is very close as well, because there is seemingly a large push towards that direction, and Ukrainian forces are reportedly closing in on that locality to control one of the largest nuclear power plants in Russia. Is it obtaining a bargain and chip with prisoners? Maybe, if you make thousands of prisoners, if you have mass surrenders and soldiers refusing to fight that you can ship out to Ukraine, then it gives you a bargaining chip, as Samantha mentioned, for potential negotiations, or being seen in a better light around potential negotiations. So that might be a case, or pure diversion, right? To divert forces from the Russian armed forces to that operational front. especially from eastern Ukraine. I don't see how this is achievable right now because of the Russian response itself, turning it into an anti-terrorist operation, quote unquote, and less of a military one. So the diversion will be limited, but I think they are adapting the objectives as they go and adapting the sort of maximal reach into Russian territory as they go. They will probably have to stop at some point, weighing their options in terms of should they consolidate, should they dig in trenches, should they partially withdraw, should they completely withdraw, what should they keep, and how much are they willing to lose as well, right? Because they've apparently sent some of their best forces across one of the weakest spots in the border. I think there's also a willingness to be aware of the potential loss, right? To avoid having an overkill of troops that would then stain the message and stain the very symbolic and the very achievement of that operation. So I think we will know more as we go, once again, because there is a high level of secrecy, and once again, because all of this is very fluid. But all of the above, right? It doesn't have to be one answer. It has to be all of the above, and we'll know more as we get more news from the war front.
Mathieu, shortly, if you can refer to, there were two questions that I got, one before the webinar, now here one about the logistics. How capable is the Ukrainian army in sustaining and maintaining control of the occupied territory that they gain control of?
I mean, a spearhead operation of that size comes with months of preparation, months of drone surveillance, as Samantha mentioned. It comes with a multi-layered and intermeshed command and control. We've seen that they've been using air defense support, artillery support, electronic warfare capabilities. So all of this requires a lot of logistics, which means that at some point you need to secure your approaches and you need to either hold the territory in a way. There are reports that Ukraine is apparently building trenches to an extent, trying to dig in physically into Russian territory. Doesn't mean they will stay, but it also means that they are potentially preparing for a long haul and potentially preparing logistically to create supply lines and supply routes that we have seen for the past 2.5 years in this war, of different lines of defense, basically between the front line and then the resupply and logistical lines all across the war front. So it is holding so far. I think the Ukrainians have become the gods of war of good military logistics for the past 2.5 years with the full-scale invasion and further to 10 years of war operations against Russia. So it's good. It is solid and it is standing, and I think they're doing it with a very clear and calculated awareness of how much lost potential there is for them, and with a very clearly calculated sort of human impact and human assessment on how much force they're ready to lose and potentially sacrifice to that operation. Very cognizant that at some point there might be a full stop to this operation. Judging from the Russian response, it seems that reinforcements are not coming as fast as expected, and that's the sort of FSB-led anti-terror operation, will also not bring about the same level of response to the incursion than expected, not least for domestic reasons, but we can come back to it. So as the response is maybe, I wouldn't say muted, but milder than expected, this will allow Ukrainian troops to dig in more, to drive more into Russian territory, and therefore to hone better logistics along the way.
Samantha, a question to you, which is not about the Ukrainians, but about the Russians. How much is this situation currently actually serves Putin versus how much is that something that is not serving it? Is there here something that actually serves Putin interests and actually strengthen his position or the Russian leadership, or is this only weakening them?
It doesn't serve Putin at all. Putin was taken completely by surprise. The slowness of the reaction shows this. The way Putin is actually qualifying this invasion, I mean, this is an invasion. He's qualifying it as a situation. He's now decided to call it the operation to remove the Ukrainians from Russian territory. He's called it a counter-terrorist operation. He's not using the word war. He's not using the word invasion. He seems very rattled. He seems extremely rattled. And up to now, he is appearing weak because he is not responding. And one thing, if I may, I'd like to add to what Mathieu said about the Russian response. What is absolutely so glaring in this response is the way the Russian population are responding and the level at which the Russian soldiers are surrendering. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, it actually tried to invade the city of Sumy, which is just on the other side of the border, of course. Sumy was held by Ukraine's territorial defense. There was hardly any official Ukrainian army in Sumy. The Russians thought there was a big army detachment there because the local population, those who had military experience and those who didn't, defended the city, not to mention the fact that the military defended the city. The Ukrainians are coming into Russia. They're having some of the largest quantities of soldiers surrendering since the beginning of the war. And these are not only conscripts, these are FSB troops, these are Chechens, the sort of supposedly fearsome Chechens are surrendering in droves. The population is fleeing. You have images coming out of the area of Russian babushkas, these old grandmothers, greeting the Ukrainians and saying, oh, you know, young man, my leg is sore, can you drive me to the next city? This is a complete contrast to what is this telling Putin about the way his own population would be prepared to defend his territory? And Putin, unless he responds in a very strong way, and perhaps we'll be getting to that later in this webinar, he is going to come out of this looking a lot weaker. And this is not something that Putin wanted. This is on a par with what happened in 2023 with the Prigozhin mutiny. This is an attack at the heart of Putin's power. And the fact, as Mathieu mentioned, that it is coming to the day that anniversary of the Kursk disaster was yesterday, 24 years since the Kursk submarine sank. Anniversary to the day of the disaster that marked his first term as a president, the disaster that revealed Putin for who he was, which is somebody who does not care about his people, who does not want to, has no presence whatsoever. Putin apparently said after the Kursk disaster, never again will you put me in front of women who've lost their sons, because he was so traumatized by the attacks, the verbal attacks that he received. This is not good for Putin. I can't see any way in which this is good for him. The result, however, might temporarily make him stronger, because he's going to, there's already a lot of talk in Russia today about censorship being tightened. Even rumors, Bloomberg came out with an article on potential mobilization. One can expect repression to increase, censorship to increase, and the whole of society to potentially go into a war-type footing. So he's going to have to try and do something to appear stronger. And the military response, perhaps we'll discuss later, is perhaps the most concerning. I'm just going to get up and close that door that's open behind me, if you don't mind.
No worries. All right. So, Mathieu, in your case, when you're looking at Putin's current situation, by the way, you're still on mute. So when you're looking at Putin's current situation, Samantha raised the point that maybe in the short term, maybe he will be considered to be a little bit more stronger because of censorship, because of etc. But in the longer term, this is going to weaken his position. This is going to weaken his image. Do we see this as something that could, in any case of form, can actually be threatening to the stability of the Russian regime in any way or form? I mean, is this the type of incursion that could be considered to be the first domino in any way or form?
I mean, we look at it from generally, sitting from global West with full access to information in general, or at least whatever information we have coming from the Ukrainian side. There is and there has always been an information wall in Russia with regards access to relevant and objective information regarding the special operation, quote unquote, let alone about this counter-terrorism operation, quote unquote. So the sort of shock and awe effect that Ukrainians can hope to achieve will depend on how people receive the information all across the Russian Federation. It's a large territory. There is now information control throughout the oblasts, the Russian oblasts that are affected by the operation, around Belgorod mostly and Kursk, of course. So I don't know yet whether this will turn into a sort of snowball domino effect that could lead to something within and with the Russian population. I don't think we're there yet. I don't think this marks, the sort of symbolic first jab at grave digging Putin into leaving power or whatever. But this is yet to be determined. I mean, yes, it is denting the prestige of everything's under control, the war narrative. It is denting the prestige of how well things are going for the war. Yes, it will require the Kremlin to go into a sort of counter information campaign to stop exposing the lies that the Kremlin has been feeding the population for the past 10 years now with the first invasion of Ukraine. But I don't see yet the elements of a domino effect, right? And it's not because we see videos of babushkis, as Samantha was mentioning, saying that, yes, the government has lied. Yes, we have not been properly taken care of. Yes, it's all lies and propaganda, but I don't see how this will achieve a sort of domino effect. We're done for, and we need to stop that war. Leading to the potential consequences of Putin deciding that to take back control of that situation, he needs to call for another round of mobilization, which would also kill the narrative that everything is under control. The move to turn it into an anti-terror operation was smart in Kremlin's terms, because it also adds an extra revealer of the situation with this sort of war of turf and territory between the FSB and the Ministry of Defense, and the fact that it looks like Putin is increasingly skeptical and critical of his own military leadership and defaults back to what he knows, which is security forces and the FSB. Comes from it. It will always be from that ethos. So he defaults back to it. So it's in a way, he comes back to his sort of zone of comfort. And then it also shows the population that actually everything's under control, right? It is a smart move in this to downplay the incursion, to prevent the massive backlash. Yes, you have people fleeing, but look, this is how it is. We're controlling everything. You have this completely bogus and fabricated briefing videos of Gerasimov telling Putin everything's fine, and then Portnikov saying exactly the same thing, that it will be fine. All of this is, state-sponsored propaganda at its best. It works great. People love it. That's the joke, but at least it's demonstrating that the Kremlin can still respond to the situation, avoid very massive measures, and avoid the humiliation of having to call for another round of mobilization. So they're a bit stuck, right, between that sort of rock and a hard place of downplaying the consequences, but also needing to respond in a swift and efficient manner, and taking back control of the border, as they call it. So we'll see. It will definitely dent his own leadership, his sense of personal safety. I haven't seen any criticism, at least public criticism, against his leadership. There've been criticism on Gerasimov. I think there was a sort of Mexican standoff between Putin, the FSB, and the army itself, as a sort of who's doing what, on how criticized Gerasimov has been throughout the start of the crisis a week ago now. So we'll have to see, right? But I completely agree with Samantha and the assessment that short term it's not good. Long term, then Putin has been dealing with crises for the past 20 something years now, and it's yet another crisis. We'll see if it survives.
So Mathieu, I want to ask you, and then I want to refer the same question to you, Samantha. The question is the following. We follow here a lot of escalation scenarios, and one of the participants, I'm not sure he's here, have raised the term, this is a third front, i.e. the Ukrainian front, the sea front, and now the Russian territory is a third front. When it comes to this conflict, this is a new third front. And one of the questions that we've been getting asked a lot, could this lead to an escalation vis-a-vis NATO allies, especially those that are hosting logistics and training grounds on the border with Ukraine, one of the Baltic states, potentially from Russia towards those states. Are we likely to see a sabotage increasing towards something much more violent, much more aggressive? Because from a Russia perspective, this has been a red line cross. So the question here, if I summarize it, are we likely to see an escalation scenario in which Russia escalates these conflicts and take it against NATO allies and their territory in some way or form?
I mean, it's a great question. At this stage, we've actually seen the opposite, right? There's a lot of talk, but not a lot of there's a lot of oomph, but not a lot of action, right? We at normal sort of peacetime, simmering, low intensity warfare, we see the Kremlin use the nuclear saber rattling threshold. We see Putin going into and the military leadership going to a lot of nuclear rhetoric. Now we've seen the opposite. We've actually seen a sort of we're the victims here, kind of. We're not happy, we're trying to de-escalate to an extent and try to downplay the very nature of what's happening, and we haven't seen any reference to the nuclear threshold as of yet. We may, should the operation continue and should Russia decide that this is going too far, or should the national security interest be at stake. They have not decided yet that the safety of the regime is at stake, which, as we know, is one of the major red lines for nuclear threshold discussions. So this might be one way to call for potential negotiations, even though Putin himself has said that there would not be negotiations. Could be a sort of, tactical moment for that. We're not going to negotiate, but actually we really want to. Because things are slipping under our control, and the nuclear threshold is out of the discussion in any case.
I want to say, let me be a little bit more specific, not necessarily from 0 to 100, i.e. nuclear, but in that gray zone in between, conventional troops, conventional forces. Is there any level of threat that we can see being pushed by Russia against those NATO allies as a result of this third front, so to speak, in that red line being crossed? Do we see something like that could happen?
I mean, yeah,
and not necessarily now. A month, 2 months from now.
They've been burning tires and rubber in the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. So yes, there's already a default back to a form of low intensity warfare operations in that sort of gray zone, to counter divert the attention away from it and say, look, it's things are not actually as easy as they seem. I don't believe in a third front, not least because at best it is diversion, and it is not. I don't think there is a willingness by Ukraine or the ability to open a third strategic front in the war sense of things. I think it is a tactical operational imperative, but not really a war front in and on itself, with a willingness to stabilize and conquer more or capture more of Russian territory to hold positions there. Yet to be determined, and we'll see what the future holds. And on NATO, I think there is the pressing imperative to respond to it, right? Trying to over-escalate with NATO or with Western countries at this stage would be another diversion of attention for the Kremlin and from the Kremlin. That would also collapse the narrative that things are under control. Why directly lash out onto NATO when you need to deal with the situation at the border first? If everything's under control, you don't need to over-escalate with the countries that have been feeding Ukraine with military assistance and weapons for the past 2.5 years. Stabilize your border first, then we'll see. So I don't see this playing out right now. It may be in the future once again, or in the very short term, depending on how the situation evolves. But I don't see it right now.
Samantha, the question to you: if this becomes a strategy by the Ukrainians, i.e., to lead land incursions into Russia itself as part of their strategy, is it possible that we are likely to see some sort of escalation via Russia and NATO allies in some way or form?
Well, it's a very difficult question to answer. And the first reason I'm going to say this is a difficult question to answer has been the American response. The Americans, who have been very reluctant to allow the Ukrainians to strike into Russian territory with their weapons. We remember even this summer, Zelensky pleading with Biden to be allowed to use long-range missiles into Russian territory. And again, the White House, and again, Jake Sullivan, John Kirby coming back saying, no, this is the red line. Even the Brits, the French saying you cannot go, you can only go so far. Now the Ukrainians have sent men right into Ukrainian territory, and they are destroying and killing Russian soldiers with US weapons. There are German Marders in Russia. There are HIMARS being used. The Germans have said that they will allow Leopard 2 tanks to be used in Russian territory. I mean, in terms of symbolism, this is more than any of us could have possibly imagined even a few weeks ago. And what is extraordinary is the Western response, which is, well, this is actually okay. So the question I have is, do the Americans know something that we don't know that make them feel that actually it's not, that the risk is not as bad as we thought it was? So that is the question that I have. I have no answer to it, but I find the American response in particular very unusual when you have a Pentagon spokesperson saying last week, oh, this is all right. I'm thinking, okay, this is a big shift. That's the first thing. So in terms of escalation, the Americans don't seem to be that worried. And they were the most worried. Another interesting thing has happened when we talk about escalation is, in a way, a nuclear threshold has been breached. This is Ukraine has attacked a nuclear armed country and invaded and is holding territory. This is unprecedented. You know, there have been skirmishes between Syria and Israel, if they want to qualify Israel as a nuclear armed country, skirmishes between India and Pakistan, but there has never been in the history of nuclear powers the incident of a country actually taking territory and with such little response from the country that's being attacked. So this is also making a lot of us in the analytical world think about, what does escalation mean? And there's the counter argument to that, which is, well, if the nuclear taboo is being broken in a way because the nuclear power is being invaded, could this give ideas to potentially Russians to break that taboo and see what happens if they send a few, do their own little incursion into, let's say, the Baltics or Poland? This is, and how would nuclear armed NATO respond? So I'm aware of the fact that I am not answering. Clearly, if Ukraine continues these incursions into Russia, Russia will be under a lot of pressure to respond. Putin will be under pressure to respond. Now we have massive evacuations from the Kursk region. The fear is this is the prelude to massive bombing by Russia of the Kursk region to get rid of the Ukrainians. This could be a massive response. And of course, the fear is there'll be massive bombardments into Ukrainian territory. That is the big fear.
Samantha, you did mention, and you touched the point about the US reaction. I want to ask you something about Ukraine's calculations before this operation. How much do you think the US elections and the possibility of change in leadership and change in US administration policy played a role in their decision to launch this attack?
Well, I think that everything that you, sorry, was that to me or? Well, I'll quickly answer. I think everything that Ukraine does, everything that Ukraine does these days is with the prism of November in mind. It's like, we need to be in the strongest possible position before a potential change of leadership in Washington. What's interesting is that this attack took place at a time when the odds of Trump becoming president seem to have gone down. I think that one of the biggest messages the Ukrainians want to send to the West is, stop telling us that we cannot strike into Russian territory, because we can send troops in there, cross the biggest, reddest line of all, and Russia is not nuking us. But Mathieu said something very, very important. He said, we have not seen escalation yet. And if this is going to be a long operation, if we're going to see more of these type of incursions, we're only a week in. It's felt like a very, very long week, but it's only a week.
No, absolutely. And I think the important message from Ukraine is that to the West is basically saying we're doing for you what 70 years of deterrence theory have collapsed overnight. And Samantha's absolutely right in terms of the tremors that this will send for the sort of nuclear deterrence field, and what we hold for granted as our own sort of territories and the sanctuary of the nuclear question. So this is definitely going to send tremors in the analytical field and further to the real policy world. Negotiation table, of course, the other message is that don't tell us what to do in terms of how much we need to sacrifice in terms of territory, in terms of negotiations moving forward, with that imperative of November. And the incursions, the raids, the operations that Ukraine have been conducting for the past week are also, you know, a sort of moment to say we're not accepting potential terms, and we will collapse that reality that we can still negotiate with the devil. Don't force us into compromises that will not work. So part of it is definitely linked to the pressure, the sort of international pressure that we've been putting on and off onto Ukraine, and further to the 2024 elections in the US. The other element is, should there actually be negotiations if Ukraine manages to have the upper hand, getting prisoners or recuperating some Russian prisoners as a bargaining chip might also be an interesting thing for Ukraine. The more Russians are laying down their weapons and surrendering without fighting, the more Ukraine can use it against the Kremlin for potential negotiations, should we go there. But once again, it has to be on Ukraine's terms, and only and if Ukraine is ready to go into negotiations. They should not be forced into any form of compromises, especially against an enemy that we know, well, we know the nature of when it comes to living up to their expectations and their promises.
Now, Mathieu, both you and Samantha touched the point on the nuclear aspect, and it is something also we in simulations that we have had in the past always looked at scenarios in which Russia is territorially invaded as a potential trigger to a very limited or to some scale of a nuclear response. How closer are we to that point? Have we heard any threats from Russia, from the Russian leadership, or from any one of their media outlets about that nuclear threat being heard, or as a potential kind of a strategy to use that threat in order to relieve the pressure they are currently under in the Kursk front?
I mean, it's a great question, but I think we're voluntarily placing sort of Western-minded analytical frameworks with red lines onto something that is way beyond a sort of, you know, simple explanation of there is a line in the sand and then the crossing is that threshold. A few years ago, it was maybe 10, 12 years ago, Putin said one of the most interesting things in passing, and not a lot of people picked up on that. He basically said, the red lines with Russia are really simple, is that you'll never know where they are, but it's only when you cross them that you actually feel the consequences of it. So it's actually a sort of obfuscation strategy that aims to make said red line extremely fluid, extremely moving, to prove that deterrence works in different ways than just established lines of, you're getting into my territory, then I need to respond, or you're getting, you know, under my skin a bit too much, I need to respond. Red lines are what they are. We draw them in sort of figurative and imaginative ways in our heads. It's more a question of perception of the threat more than the reality of the threat. And so far, the Kremlin has reserved the right to acknowledge that red lines are extremely fluid and fluctuating. We haven't seen that red line or proverbial red line crossed yet. It doesn't mean it hasn't been, and that they will tell us later, and that we will feel the consequences of it through different forms of escalation. And we've seen the Kremlin work really well in that sort of gray zone escalation or gray zone deterrence, the ability to respond asymmetrically to perceived threats, or to the reality of that threat through different forms of operations that do not necessarily match the intention of the reported enemy. So it's not because we are, getting potentially closer to that nuclear red line that the Kremlin will respond in kind. They could do it in many different ways. I don't see how this would play out right now, because they're very occupied with dealing with the situation right now, and probably have bigger fishes to fry than what's happening at the Finnish border or elsewhere. But we'll see. And deterrence works also both ways. As we know, it's not just us trying to deter the Kremlin. It's also the willingness of the Kremlin to be deterred in the first place. And your ability to deter anyone is only factored to the willingness of that target to be deterred in the first place. As far as we know, Russia does not want to feel or be deterred by our attempts at intimidation, quote unquote, or our expansion, quote unquote, of NATO borders, right? With Finland and Sweden freely joining the alliance now, which Russia perceives as an expansion of the front line and an expansion of the war front as it is against NATO. So it also feeds into that logic of perceptions, the psychology behind it, that it's not so much the red line that I'm concerned about these days. It's more about the miscalculation behind it. To conclude on this, is that, yes, we have established frameworks of deterrence. They were great on paper. We've seen Ukraine actually rewrite those papers overnight. Now we need to deal with a potential escalatory dynamic with regards miscalculation. The absence of clear lines of communication could lead to tactical errors with the Western community or with NATO, incidents, accidents leading into an intended escalation. And because we just don't speak, and when we speak, we don't listen, and when we listen, we just don't hear each other, then this might lead to something extremely emotional or extremely sort of short-sighted that could lead to escalation. And then we would go into potentially a nuclear threshold, or at least discussing the potentiality of that nuclear threshold, especially if there is in the Kremlin the feeling that things are slipping under their control, or that they are no longer able to ensure the safety of the territory. So that I'm more worried about than the proverbial red line.
Samantha, I want to move from the escalation to the de-escalation scenario potential, and that is, can we see the possibility that the opening of the third front, or the opening of a new strategy in which Russian territory is being invaded by Ukrainian troops, to serve as a driver to push Russia into the negotiation table in a much more favorable conditions for Ukraine, willing to compromise, willing to basically put an end to the war by removing their troops from the territory occupied? I know we discuss a lot about the escalation scenarios, which are basically Russia responding with more force, Russia responding with basically escalating the situation. But I want to analyze the potential of this serving as a driver for a de-escalation, actually. Do you see that as a potential thing? You're on mute. You're on mute.
Yeah, I'll start by quoting Putin, and then I'll try and decode what Putin said. Putin said yesterday or the day before, I can't remember, I think it was the day before, he said, this incursion into our territory shows that one cannot negotiate with these people. From now on, all negotiation is off. How can we negotiate with people who bomb our territory, who kill our women and children, and who take our men prisoner? I mean, this sounds like Putin saying, and of course, nobody can negotiate with me either, because that is exactly what I do. That is what Putin is saying. I think that from the Ukrainian point of view, they hope that this will open up a potential for better negotiations for them, because the message I think they might be trying to send is, if you don't end this war, we're going to continue doing this, and we're going to continue weakening you. There'll be Bryansk, there'll be Belgorod, there'll be, we might try and go further. There will be more and more attacks on your territory, and this will weaken you. And it seems that they're practically trying to push Putin to get up to that nuclear threshold and to see and to call his bluff. I mean, it's a very, very brave and potentially very dangerous game that the Ukrainians are playing. But I think they're trying to push him. And again, to repeat what I said before, the apparent relaxedness with which the West is observing what is happening leads me to think that particularly the Americans may feel that this is not dangerous and that this could have a positive outcome for Ukraine. Again, I'm only reading the signals here. I don't have inside information into the kind of decision-making places in Ukraine that would give clear answers to that. But I think that it could have that effect, and it could have the absolute opposite effect. And I realize how frustrating it is to be saying one thing and then another. I don't think it will have a neutral effect. I think we will either see more back channels being opened and Putin realizing that this is really, really going to drag on forever. And the West is now determined to support Ukraine for as long as possible. So we cannot go on. Some of his generals might be thinking the same thing, or he could say, okay, enough is enough, and escalate. I don't see us going back to business as usual. I don't see the Ukrainians just suddenly deciding, okay, we're going to go home now. We've shown what we can do. We're going to go home.
Now, one of the, I would say, interesting insights we got when we spoke to other experts was about the possibility of Russia to basically escalate. And the question many of them raised was not so much if they have the will, but do they have the capacity? In other words, can they go on a recruitment of personnel? Can they bring in more tanks, older tanks than what they're using now from the armories? Can they bring in more armor and more weaponry from suppliers such as North Korea, Iran, and so on? Meaning, it seems as if in many ways Russia's kind of hit the bottom of the barrel. And the question to you, Samantha, do you think maybe this is a way for the Ukrainian have identified that, and maybe it's a way for them to basically say, we reached the breaking point logistically for the Russians. If we put more push maybe in other points as well, this is a testing ground for this theory for them. And if it works, maybe they'll remove and do it again. Maybe this will be the one that will show, okay, we can do this. Now we can push them to break point and to force them into negotiations.
I think that is a point, but I think we also have to bear in mind the fact that on the ground in Ukraine, there are certain places where things are not going very well. You know, Chasiv Yar could potentially fall. I mean, it's been about to fall for a few months now, but the pressure is increasing in Chasiv Yar. It's also increasing in Konstantinivka. We're going into the autumn and the winter when it'll be more difficult to move on the front, and where the electricity problems that Ukraine is facing will be felt a lot more strongly, particularly in terms of access to heating. But you're absolutely right. Russia is showing that it is definitely beginning to go down, you know, to lack munition. It's bringing old tanks into service. It's buying missiles from Iran. There's also this joke going about that, you know, Putin persuaded Iran not to strike Israel because it wants the missiles for Russia, although unfortunately it would seem that Iran has quite a good stockpile of missiles. But and then we come to the question, conventionally, Russia is beginning to lack men. Mobilization would be highly unpopular. It is now using conscripts, not as conscripts, but it is taking young men, conscripting them, immediately offering them a contract to go in as a contract soldier, because they don't have enough volunteers. Mobilization would be deeply unpopular. So I think Putin will avoid that, in spite of what Bloomberg is saying, for as long as he possibly can. But the issue is here, okay, if I don't have enough men, I don't have enough tanks, I don't have enough artillery shells, what do I do? And this is where the fear of heavy bombardment of the Ukrainian positions in Russia comes to the fore. Already last week, some of the civilians who had been evacuated from Kursk said, and this has not been verified, but it does kind of fall into Russian way of dealing with things, have been saying that some of their villages have been bombed before they were fully evacuated. And I'd like to remind you of how Russia carries out its counter-terrorist operations, and this is called a counter-terrorist operation. They have full powers. The aim is to destroy the terrorists. It doesn't matter how many civilians get killed. Look at what happened in Chechnya, which was a counter-terrorist operation. Look at what happened in the Nordoff theater. Look what happened in Beslan. Look, this is how Russia deals with these kind of problems. It just goes in with its heavy boots and it bombs. And again, the massive evacuation that we're now seeing from the Kursk Oblast does seem to suggest that Putin might be intending to use massive aerial bombardment, conventional and bombardment to flush out the Ukrainians, even if that means completely flattening villages and towns.
Now, Mathieu, I want to refer to you. We have 8 minutes, so I'm gonna kind of make it a question, but just also kind of final remarks. Samantha clearly described this as kind of a watershed moment in the conflicts situation that we're having here. Either it will escalate or de-escalate, but something's going to change, because this is definitely a massive change to basically be contained and ignored. In your opinion, and how do you analyze this thing if this continues, meaning more incursions by Ukraine into Russian territory, and the possibility of Ukraine in holding the territory altogether, plus the other incursion, maybe yes, maybe not. What are we likely to see moving forward in terms of the war? How do you see this basically developing?
So, listen, I think it will be for history books to judge what it is, right? If it's a watershed, if it's a turning point, if it's an sort of anecdote or footnote in the history of the war. I don't know yet, right? Wars are won or lost through battles. This is clearly a decisive battle. Yet I don't know what will be the exact consequences of it. This could be, once again, the first nail in Putin's coffin. This could be a footnote in, the amazing brazenness and ability of Ukrainians to fight back and to reach operational surprise and to surprise us. I don't know yet, right? So as we don't clearly see what the exact contour of the military objectives are yet, as things evolve and move along every day, there's a new map. And we wake up to a new map of the reality of how much Ukraine is pushed further into Russian territory. We'll see what these consequences are, I think. On the strategic level, I think the main point is exactly what Samantha mentioned on the very question, cost of deterrence. That will also ask all the right people the right questions about how we deal with a nuclear power that has been now under pressure to respond to that incursion and to respond further. So, to be determined. I don't want to venture into hypotheses on what this will mean for the rest of the war. If we're really talking about Ukrainians keeping that territory and consolidating their position and digging up trenches, it means they're in for the long haul, right? And they will likely stay and try to maximize their take, maximize their keep, and making sure that this is not an anecdote or footnote in the history of the war, but potentially a turning point. So I think the onus is on Ukraine to turn it into what it is they want to turn it into, and we'll have to support it regardless of what it is, and making sure we can offer and help Ukraine as much as possible in fighting for their survival and their freedom.
Samantha, how do you see this situation evolving or developing, considering the potential for escalation, de-escalation that we have already discussed in this session?
Oh, difficult question. This was such a surprise that every day I'm reading the developments and thinking that what's going to happen now. I actually think he's going to carpet bomb the Kursk region. I think, and he's going to really take it out on Ukraine. I hope I'm wrong, but and then I think that the result will be that the West will potentially give the green light for the use of the storm shadows and the attack MS in further into Russian territory. Again, I do not see Putin allowing Ukraine to dig in for the long haul. And I'm going out on a limb here because I could be completely wrong. But I think he's gonna bomb. He's gonna bomb them out. He's not gonna let them stay. He still has the capacity to do that, even if it means killing Russians.
And we do see that currently there is, I would say, limitations posed by the United States, by other NATO allies on the use of strategic weapons, not nuclear, but like you say, the storm shadows and so on, within Russia, with some limitations. Do you see how basically the current situation or the current strategy in which the Ukrainians are applying, do you see that something that will evolve into basically not lifting those restrictions, but even putting more limitations on them in order for them to basically avoid from having those kind of incursions into Russia itself?
At this point, I don't, for the simple reason that the West has responded in a very, very calm, matter-of-fact way to this incursion, and has basically said, well, this is what we expected. Ukraine is allowed to defend itself. I can't really see the West, however uncoordinated and contradictory some countries may be amongst themselves and within themselves. I can't see them going from this is fine to, oh, you can't do anything. I think a lot of the Western response will depend on how this evolves internally in Ukraine, whether Zelensky comes out of this stronger or weakened. Because if this is an absolute disaster, and as Mathieu mentioned, some of the elite troops being used, if they end up being decimated in massive carpet bombing, this will not be good for Syrski, the chief of general staff, and it will not be good for Zelensky, because Zelensky has now said that he backs this. So I think it's really early to say whether the West will put limitations or not on weapons. My gut feeling is if things continue the way they have been for the last week, we will not see those limitations. But this is a very, very, very fast moving picture, and it's really hard to come out with black or white answers. The only area I'm still doing it on the limb out is saying I think we're going to see some pretty bloody carpet bombing. And if we don't, that'll be a sign that Putin is a lot weaker than we thought. And it could be an opening for negotiations.
So at this point, exactly on the minute, I want to thank Samantha and Mathieu. Thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion on ongoing situation developing. Not easy to provide analysis considering the lack of or the information that we're receiving, which is unclear. So I know you did your best based on what you know, but I definitely learned a lot from this. So thank you so much for joining us today, both of you. And I want to thank everybody who joined us today also. Thank you so much for joining us. I just want to tell you that probably in next week, we are going to have another webinar, this time a different area, Bangladesh, South Asia, the situation there. So stay tuned. We will inform you via our newsletter and social media. Thank you, everybody who joined us. Thank you very much. Take care.